Thanks for joining us today to explore the fuzzy front end of project life cycles. One of my favorite topics, actually. So I hope that I don't geek out too much for you. I do join you from a client site today, so explains the difference in the background here. But still, nonetheless, very pleased to be doing this for y'all. Bob, appreciate that. I really do appreciate that feedback. So as ever, I know I say this every time, sound like a broken record, but I've got a lot to cover today. So I am going to be brisk as usual. Today's topic is navigating the fuzzy front end and how we can work specifically within that part of the product development or project lifecycle, regardless of what type of workflow lifecycle you have, projects, products, or whatever. Often a lot of the same dynamics are at play. So we will explore some of that. Now, as usual, today is not about any type of a prescription or, there's not a step-by-step process here that I'm here to share with you. But I am here to share with you some concepts and some common denominators that usually can be applied sort of at a foundational level, no matter what your framework is. So quick agenda for today. We will discuss a little bit about visibility of work, work in progress. We did talk a little bit about this in some previous presentations. There's a few slides that if you've seen my presentations before, you might see some of those again, but even those will be having a bit of a different spin on. So we'll talk a little bit about value streams, and we will talk about some concepts like decentralizing decision-making, federating decision-making, things like that, especially in the front end. Now, those are concepts that can apply at all types of a product development lifecycle or project lifecycle, but we're particularly interested in kind of like unblocking the flow of work from the front end today. And then I'll introduce you to just a couple of economic rubrics like cost of delay or CD3. Some of you guys may be familiar with tools like WizGIF or something like that. Then I'm going to talk, actually, quite a primary part of today's presentation is about some of the thought leaders that I actually have paid the most attention to over the years, and folks that I think have really been great beneficiaries, or rather benefactors, I should say. The rest of us are the beneficiaries of their expertise. And I do that to kind of just turn you on to them and point you in their direction. Sometimes the folks have not heard of these people, even though they've informed some of the frameworks and concepts that we use all the time. So I'm going to introduce you to some of their concepts and some of their product flow tools and just some about who they are. So after today, if you take away nothing else, you will leave with some points in the right direction on ways people you can read up on to find to become much better at navigating the product and project lifecycle. There's really four in particular, and here they are. You'll see them come up as we go along. It's Gene Kim, Jez Humble, Don Reinertsen, and Joshua Arnold. And like I say, we'll talk a little bit more about them. So as I move to this next slide here, I'd like to ask a question. And if we were all in a room together, I would ask people to raise their hand, but I'll just ask the question rhetorically. How many people have ever been involved? And actually, feel free to holler in the chat if you don't mind. We would love to see if this resonates. But how many people have ever been involved in a project or a product development effort or any kind of initiative in which you got a certain way into it? It was well underway. There was much effort being given to it. And then at some point in the project, it became gradually clear, and there was gradually a shared understanding amongst people on that team that, you know what, this project is not meeting the need that it probably was initially instigated for. Or this project is doomed. Or, you know what, we're all working on this, but we feel like this is probably going to get canceled. Or we are working on this project or product, but there's a growing sense that, users are never going to use this, or this product is probably not going to be adopted. I wonder if anybody's ever experienced that. I see some thumbs up. Yes, obviously it's rhetorical. We have all probably experienced situations like that. Then we have to ask ourselves in that situation, and I'm sure we all do, was that work valuable? Was that G&A money well spent? What type of ROI are we looking at there? None. It's a common situation. Now, here's another one. How many people have ever worked on a large, expensive project or product development effort only to go back and find out later, maybe even years later, that, you know what, there ended up being very few or even no users for that product. We built something and it never got used. I wonder if anyone has ever encountered that. And once again, of course, appreciate the feedback if anyone ever has. So people understand this, and so this is, for one thing, yes, unfortunately, it's very, very disheartening. Nobody really would choose to be in that type of a situation. No one would like to, if they had their choice, work on something that a bunch of effort went into, and then you found out it got mothballed. We find out ourselves asking ourselves, was this valuable? So not very good. So let's think about this from the perspective of the de facto building block of project and product development work streams that we are all probably quite familiar with these days, the Agile team. So the Agile team is, this is not a presentation on Agile teams, so I'm going to trust that everyone has a basic familiarity with the concepts of an Agile team and how approaches like Scrum and things like that work, other Agile approaches and the roles and things like that, right? So if we think about the Agile team as, what is, I think, pretty broadly accepted these days as being a fundamental building block of value creation. So everybody knows the Agile team is there to produce value, but of course that value production is always in response to a need, right? The Agile team is there to meet a need. And that need obviously is going to be a need for a feature or for a product or for just any kind of business need. I would say it's just always going to be some type of business or organizational need. If you're in a government agency or a nonprofit, there's usually a mission-driven need or something like that. So whether they refer to that as business need or not doesn't really matter. There's a need there, right? So let's think about that need for just a moment. And if you saw my last webinar, you saw this little series of slides, but similar concept, but we're going to be thinking about it through a different lens today. So if we think about that need as being essentially the genesis of a value stream, or of a series of efforts on behalf of that team that is there to generate whatever is the response to the need, we think about that. And often things will look like this, right? So that will usually go through some type of business analysis, maybe requirements building, or maybe discovery. Maybe there's some Agile product discovery there, and if so, that's great. But one way or the other, there's usually some specification. Very oversimplified here, but from there we move into development. Then there's usually some type of a QA function, and then perhaps some release. And then finally, it gets into operational production environment after delivery. Now we want to, and then hopefully there's some kind of feedback as well. Metrics or behavior can be understood, by the way that our product behaves in production, gets back upstream to the people who are making decisions and analyzing business needs and requirements and things like that. And then we'll highlight just this delivery phase very quickly, because an important point to note here is that everything up until this point, so everything from the need and these other functional steps, the analysis, development, testing, release, all of this, everything before delivery, this is just overhead, right? It's not directly contributing to value creation unless delivery happens. And then, of course, all of that investment does stand a chance of producing ROI or value of some sort. But delivery is a very special step in this life cycle, because there is no value without delivery. Because unless things get delivered, they can never be used, they can never be adopted, they never see the light of day. And so, until you successfully reach that point of delivery, then everything is overhead. So it's just an important point to make. Now, I want to make one other point about this. This may seem an old-fashioned workflow to some of you, especially if you're in a more product-forward work stream environment, or if you're in a more of a modern, like Agile shop where agility and those practices have been successfully adopted. And if so, good for you. But my point is that this is still valid from a functional perspective. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that your workflow is progressing sequentially over time through these, or it doesn't mean that these are necessarily departments. But there's multiple ways you could organize this. But one way or the other, these functions will have to be performed either in parallel, or continuously, or in a phase-gated fashion, an old-fashioned waterfall project management, or whatever. So but these things will all have to happen. The thing that matters is there's no value without delivery, and then things live in production, and then hopefully there's a feedback loop there. So it's good to think about what that feedback loop looks like, right? So I'll introduce you now that we've looked at that little sort of workflow diagram. Many of you may have heard of this. Certainly, if you're familiar with DevOps, you have definitely heard of Gene Kim, who co-authored the Phoenix Project some years back, even more than 10 years ago. Hard to believe, but if you've read this book, The Phoenix Project, and if you feel like it, you can tell me in the chat if you either have read The Phoenix Project or if you've never heard of it. I'd love to hear that too. But one of the main themes that Gene and his co-authors touch on in The Phoenix Project is that he draws this parallel between the world of manufacturing and the world of IT and technological and sort of invisible product development. And he draws a parallel here. And he explains kind of how in the world of manufacturing, they actually had a lot of the same problems with workflow. And he talks about kind of how they solved some of those problems. And some of those things have been adopted in our industries as well, things like Kanban and, even the and-on core quality first, shift left, if you've ever heard that phrase. The concept of shifting left is all about getting out ahead of the flow. But it's all about flow, really, right? Like walking up above the factory floor so you can see where things are piling up, so you can spot bottlenecks. You're building quality into the product instead of putting inspectors at the end of the assembly line after all the work has been done and they find a defect and then you just have to trash it and it's all reworked. That's obviously very expensive. So those kinds of ideas borrowed from manufacturing are very central to the Phoenix Project. I highly recommend the Phoenix Project too, by the way. So for those of you who answered in the chat, just as commentary, so that the Phoenix Project is essentially the book that launched the DevOps movement to world prominence. Gene did not invent the concept of DevOps, but he was one of the early small circle of professionals that was very close, and he was around and tight with some of the original thought leaders, Patrick Dubois and others like that, who kind of coined that original phrase DevOps. And then he wrote this book, which was all about how DevOps works. And so if you're a DevOps guy, which I certainly am, and you certainly should be, then you should definitely read this. It's a quick read. It's an easy read. It's a fiction book. So, but flow, yes. So if we think about Gene's concepts, and he presents in this book these what he calls the three ways, and I don't have time to go into all three ways today, but the first way is just simply flow. And it's obvious why this should be a priority concept, because the flow of work through your system is going to dictate how much gets delivered. How much gets delivered is going to dictate how much value is produced. And I mean value in dollars and cents terms, right? Like ROI, usage, sales, things like that. So if you can increase your flow, then you can increase your value production and you can increase ROI to the organization. And this is the kind of thing that leaders should be thinking about all the time, right? But, as project managers and product owners and people on development teams and things like that, a lot of times we're not necessarily thinking about the overall flow of work and value delivery through that entire system, because our environments are just so large and complicated. The work is very gnarly, and we have our piece of the world that we're looking at, and we might think about flow through our area of our work, but who thinks about flow from start to finish? Who thinks about flow from the initial business need all the way through those functional areas we talked about, all the way through to delivery, and all the way through to the flow of feedback on the behavior of a product or finished project in production? It's a rhetorical question. Who thinks about that, right? So these are a few principles of flow that Gene presents, and these are not, Gene did not. He did not invent these by any stretch. He just kind of repackaged them for DevOps. But these are, really taken from Lean, and in some ways the ideas are quite old. But they're kind of becoming new again when we think about enterprise knowledge work or enterprise technology work, the kind of work that people like us are involved in. And so, I won't talk to these necessarily individually, but I'll just run through them real quick. Making invisible work visible helps us to understand bottlenecks and increase our flow. Having techniques and processes in place to limit our WIP, to limit our work in process. We'll talk a little bit more about that here shortly. Reducing batch sizes, because as you can imagine, a smaller batch of work can be moved along faster. It's also cheaper to manipulate and process. So the smaller the batch sizes, the more batches you can move through, and the faster you can move them through. So you can see how that would increase flow. Reducing handoffs. I think that's probably pretty self-explanatory. Continually identify and elevate constraints. What does that one mean? That means you don't really have to think about solving all of the problems in your system. You just need to be able to identify the biggest problem in your system. And then when you elevate that constraint or challenge or problem, you're making that the most important thing to solve. And this is, again, a little bit oversimplified, but in some ways you can think about it could potentially be a real waste of time to really even work on solving any of the other problems until the biggest problem is solved, because that's your biggest bottleneck. That's your biggest constraint. So that's what that means. And then, of course, once you're able to visualize and map your value stream, we talked a little bit about that in our last presentation, then you can understand what is adding value to the flow and what is not adding value to the flow. And you can begin to eliminate and reduce those less value-added steps, those wasteful steps. So that's flow, and that's Gene Kim. So definitely check out Gene Kim. Definitely check out the Phoenix Project. Now, if we go back to our little flow diagram here for a moment, we think about this. We're thinking about flow. No matter how these different functions are organized, there's always going to be a way to map flow through a system like that. So if we're thinking about that, the Agile team that I talked about, they're really primarily focused on this one little area of the system, right? Development, potentially testing. Sometimes Agile teams and the Agile work patterns do move downstream just from software engineering or development to testing, and maybe even in a somewhat mature environment, maybe the Agile process applies to all of the steps in this flow, or all the function of this flow, or maybe if you're seeing success with an Agile framework, or you're practicing agility at scale or something like that, maybe you are starting to think about these things. And certainly, some frameworks like SAFe and other frameworks for organizational agility or business agility are definitely thinking about flow through this entire series of steps. But there's something else to think about here as well, besides just that, and that's the fact that you kind of got like these other concerns in a large enterprise environment. It's not just the flow of work through that technology or product or project development lifecycle is not standing alone. And these are just a few of them, right? We could think about a lot more, I'm sure, but you've probably often got the project management concerns here, or product concerns. There may be a PMO sitting over the portfolio. These may be shared services. um, development teams or testing or QA teams. These may be shared services, and then the how those services or the bandwidth gets divvied up may be governed by PMO. And we have to think about, all right, well, which product are we going to work on today? Which one is the next priority for us to perform QA on? Which one's getting released next? Because we're not working on just one project or product in an enterprise environment. We have a whole portfolio of projects and products. So how do we prioritize that stuff, and how do we manage that? It's a whole other dimension. And then, of course, there's often compliance, risk, security concerns. It's a whole other layer of constraints sometimes. And then you might have a business unit constructs who are competing for these shared services. Just might not always be the case, but often it is. So you've got all these concerns kind of crowding in on this flow engine that we're looking at. And so that's, we can see how things begin to get complex, right? So this causes some issues. So let's take a step back here, and then I want to introduce you to one of my other favorite thought leaders here. Now, Joshua Arnold, if I'm not mistaken, I believe he's based out of New Zealand, where SoftEd is based out of. But long before I was doing work with SoftEd, I was paying close attention to Joshua Arnold because he's a super innovative guy, and I love his concepts. But this is a quote from Joshua, which I will read aloud here. Most organizations don't suffer from a lack of innovative ideas. They suffer from not being able to pick and nurture the best ones and then deliver them quickly enough. Thanks to the consumerization of IT and software eating the world, this is getting worse. So I'll stop there for a moment. I think probably you'll get no argument from me on that. Certainly in the organizations that I work with, what you usually find is they've got great people and there's a lot of great ideas. And I don't just mean that people are creative and they're riffing on imaginative ideas. I mean, there's a lot of great business ideas. Like if you could wave a magic wand and manifest some of the ideas that the people have, there's no question that there would be business value there right away. So there's no shortage of great ideas. Back in the day, I used to think that concepts and ideation was the hard part. And then the execution was the easy part. And I had an ongoing debate with a college buddy of mine who was in the same space. And he would always argue that ideas were the easy part and execution was the hard part. And I would kind of argue the reverse back, this is a long time ago. And of course, in those days, I was sort of an individual practitioner. And so I had complete control over all of my own work. And so for that reason, I felt like execution was fairly straightforward, but I would have a hard time coming up with just the right idea. So I thought that was hard. But here we are years later, and I do realize that actually, my buddy was the one who was right, at least in an enterprise environment. There's never a shortage of good ideas. It's actually prioritizing, organizing, and then executing and delivering those ideas that is the hard part. And as Joshua says here, with all of the commoditized software available and just all of the services and all this, there's just no shortage of ways to execute. So the question is not how to execute. The question becomes what to execute. Am I building the right thing? And then another point here, if I go back, if I go back to this slide, all of this, which is involved in producing, I think, for argument's sake, we'd say software products or features, but this could be any kind of knowledge-based product. So just as here, in most organizations, innovation, the word innovation and software development is often already synonymous. Software development are often early adopters for innovation practices. Agile practices lend themselves, in some cases, best to software teams and things like that. So for those and other reasons, software development is often synonymous with innovation. Now, I'm not saying that's every organization, but I think it's a valid point. So for the point of the next few minutes, we want to think about that, and we'll go back here to our little software engine here, and we'll think about that as being true. We're just going to kind of pretend that, the ability to produce the right software, to produce the right IT service, to produce the right knowledge product, or even physical product in some cases. The ability to do that is synonymous with the ability to innovate and to execute on that innovation. So we're just going to think about that. So what we see here, what we've talked about, this knowledge-based work or software workflow, we're going to take that and we're going to say, okay, that's synonymous with the ability to innovate. And so that's going to cause some issues. So let's think about those. And well, just a few of the issues that we encounter right away. We're going to put our innovation engine front and center here. We've got our software workflow. We've got our Agile team. Maybe the Agile team is like sitting right in here in app dev, maybe. And then maybe if we're lucky, we have some organizational agility structure sitting over top of that. But that's going to be our innovation, which we've already got kind of initiatives, our PMO, risk concerns, other concerns that are crowding in on just the ability to pure T innovate with software development. But now we've actually got other competing concerns as well, right? Different lines of business, different strategic initiatives, internal politics, Lord knows we all deal with that, right? And then just whatever reality is, whatever changing market conditions, users that now want something different, emergent needs or requirements that we didn't realize we had before, all kinds of things, right? As we always say here at SoftEd, it's a VUCA world, things are volatile and uncertain and complex and ambiguous. We sometimes we don't know what's going to hit us until it happens. So this becomes very complex, right? So this is just kind of my attempt to sort of graphically illustrate just with shapes and words, the behavior of the enterprise environment and what's expected from us to innovate in terms of actually executing on innovation. Everybody believes in innovation, but how do you actually execute on innovation? So I want to introduce you now again to my next thought leader. His name is Jez Humble, and I would love to know if anybody is familiar with Jez. Jez is one of my, frankly, he's one of my idols. I think it's safe to say. He's one of the most brilliant individuals that I've encountered in the world of enterprise software for sure, but later in the world of product ownership and product related and product forward roles. So I definitely check out Jez. He's a very engaging speaker. You can see some of his videos on YouTube. Beverly, you're exactly right. Just do it. Unfortunately, it's not always that easy as Nike makes it sound. So Jez Humble was co-author of a book in 2011 called Continuous Delivery. And now, if you recognize the phrase continuous delivery, it may be because you recognize it from the Agile Manifesto, in which the founders of the Agile Manifesto said right there in the beginning, our highest priority is to deliver value to the customer through early and continuous delivery of software. Now, that has grown to mean more than just software, but I think most people believe the Agile Manifesto's concepts hold, at least in principle. But Jez literally wrote the book with David Farley on technically executing continuous delivery. I think it's funny. I always say it took 10 years for somebody to write a book on actually how to do continuous delivery, because it was 2001 that the Agile Manifesto was signed, and the founders said, this is our highest priority, right? They literally said our highest priority is delivery of value through continuous delivery. And it was 2011, 10 years later, when Jez and David wrote this book to explain, actually from a technical standpoint, okay, well, how do you actually do that? And even then, this was it was perceived as quite radical in some cases. Bob, couldn't agree more with that. Just to agree, I'll leave it at that. So Jez Humble, you can see, you can find videos online where Jez has delivered keynotes talking about what he calls water scrum fall. Now, there's other words for things like this, but we've maybe encountered something like this. So if we think about the value stream that I just showed a few moments ago, this in some ways is just another way to look at it. So we're looking at it kind of from a top down, how project life cycles usually commence. But importantly, with this, it's not always just going to be software projects. It could really be any type of initiative. So starting to accommodate and build into the value stream, like if I go back, if I go back to this one, where we've got kind of a software value stream here, and then it's starting to get crowded in on by PMO concerns and priorities and compliance requirements and security and, the competing interests of our business units and things like that. So, but if we kind of think about that and start to order some of those other concerns into also a value stream. It might look something like this, but this is how Jez would present it. You've usually got, again, some business analysis, the PMO and finance often involved in some feasibility or whatever, design and planning. So that's kind of the front end. And then you've got maybe your agile teams, if they are agile. And then again, there's really another layer of analysis. Then there's actual development and building of things. And then there's usually testing and then some demoing and things like that. So we're iterating on this, right? We're iterating and gradually and emergently producing the product or the feature. And then you have downstream IT, and again here sometimes you have centralized QA. Now I think since I first saw this concept of water scrum fall introduced, I think centralized Q&A is not as much of a thing as it used to be because people are endeavoring to shift left, build quality in. There's a lot of tools as well out there now that there were not in 2011, which allow you to do code scanning or kind of continuous product quality monitoring, things like that. But that still is a thing in some organizations. So you may have a testing department or something like that, and then have a release and operations. So this is another way to think about it. So if we think about it like this is what we mean by the fuzzy front end. It's this top layer of the cake, the study, the approval, the feasibility, things that finance trying to understand. Okay, what do we need to invest in this? What's the priority of what's our investment mix? Are we investing in the right thing? Are we approving the right thing? Often these cycles are annual as well, as we all know. So a lot of times these budget cycles operate on an annual cycle time, which is quite a long cycle time. And then, once investments are approved and funding is released, then, there's still design and planning and things like that. It's interesting. I'm involved in a project right now in which I've been engaged essentially just to do a study on, what might be possible and how to plan for it. I'm not saying that that's not a valid need. I'm just saying that this is where it happens, right? So the fuzzy front end, why is it fuzzy? Because it often doesn't have quite as much framework around it or process around it. There's not as much methodical approach to this side of the work here, right? Like, who's ever worked with a CFO's office, if you've worked with them at all, in which they have a methodical process-based approach to prioritizing and releasing funding for features or projects. Not saying that doesn't happen. I honestly don't know if it happens. I think it often does not. But is there something? Is there an equivalent of Scrum, or is there equivalent of SAFe, or is there equivalent of an Agile framework to sort of organize, compartmentalize, and help prioritize the things when they're living up here in feasibility or in the design phase? So those are some of the reasons of why I refer to it as the fuzzy front end, because the other thing you have to think about is, this is where all the ideas are living, right? So there's an inventory there. There's an inventory of probably really good ideas or really important needs, and they're sitting. Whoops, sorry about that. They're sitting up here, and they're waiting to be released to the actual work stream, which gets it closer and closer to delivery. In which, remember, ideas, no matter how good, they're not going to produce any value until there's delivery. So delivery. Can't say it enough. All right. So now this is another graphic I borrowed from a Jez presentation. This was conducted by Forrester. It's quite an older study at this point, but it was commissioned by ThoughtWorks. So ThoughtWorks, very very innovative organization, and Jez at one point worked for ThoughtWorks, and so he had insight into this. But they conducted this survey, which asked this one question survey, right? Select the statement that most closely aligns with how you decide which products are built. So there's a product discovery angle there, and there's a prioritization angle there, and there's an investment angle there. How does your company decide which products are built? And you can see how they do this. So almost half decides by committee from the options. About a fourth have a financial modeling, some kind of an economic model that they use. 13%, a not insignificant slice. It's just the opinion of the person with the highest salary. They just make the decision, and that's how we decide what we're going to invest in. 9% at the time this study was done, at least, used a product portfolio approach. Now, I'm hopeful that would be a larger wedge of the pie these days, but for sure, it's still something that a lot of organizations are investigating or trying to think about. Again, Beverly, couldn't agree more. That's quite related, right? So loudness, whoever is just willing to bang the drum the most, whether that's an internal hippo or not. And then they said they added this last option just for fun, maybe. No systematic approach at all, and I was actually quite impressed that actually 7% of the people actually answered that, right? So I think there's an important point here. Let me see. Do I have the ability to annotate here? I don't think I do. So hopefully you can kind of see my cursor. But if you think about this really basically boils down to two categories. If you think about whether or not there's a methodical approach or whether or not there's not a methodical approach, right? So if you think about decision by committee, that is not a methodical approach. Decision by hippo, or the highest paid person in the room, that is not a methodical approach. So that gets you, to 47, 50, 60%. No systematic approach, that adds another 7 there. So those three options are no systematic approaches. Now, if you use a product portfolio approach, 9%, plus financial modeling, 24%. So that's 33%. So 1 out of 3, or about 1/3, in aggregate across this survey, used some type of methodical approach, leaving 2/3 really without any real methodical approach on deciding what product we're going to build and invest in. So quite powerful. The highest paid person's opinion, or as Beverly said in the chat, the loudest customer, or the VIP customer who contributes the most to the bottom line, right? Like that's these individuals are often quite responsible for deciding what we're going to build. Happens all the time. So 76%, between 2/3 and 3/4. Really, and actually, sorry, if I go back here now, product portfolio approach. Now that may or may not have an economic modeling component, right? So we're basically left with very little economic modeling to make these decisions. So basically, at the time this study was conducted, 76% didn't use any economic framework for deciding and prioritizing product commitments. So when you put it in those stark terms, it seems pretty mind-blowing, right? Now, going back to Jez here, it was interesting because after Jez and his co-authors released Continuous Delivery, they wrote that. They wrote some other great books since. Jez, by the way, was one of the founding members of this organization called Dora. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Dora, now owned by Google. If you're not, you should check that out. But a mover and a shaker, suffice to say. So then the Phoenix project came out, and Jez and Gene Kim are tight. So after they published those things, then especially with continuous delivery, because it was so technically executing focused, tooling focused, and engineering. It was an engineering blueprint. So companies wanted to engage Jez as a consultant, and you can find the videos on YouTube where he talks about this. Companies wanted to engage Jez to come and consult with them on, well, how do I build my delivery tool chains? Help my IT department, do my system integration, tooling integration, help us engineer the tooling that we need for downstream IT so that we can do CI/CD and things like that. And so, but when Jez and his colleagues would go in and evaluate the organization, what they found was that all of the delays and trouble and slowness was actually happening at the front end that we talked about, up there in that top layer of the cake with the PMO and the decision making and the funding and the financial approvals and things like that. So this was interesting, right? Because Jez had written this engineering book, which ostensibly focused on the downstream area of the technology value stream, but really what was preventing the unlocking of value was all of this upstream stuff. So it's interesting to hear him talk about that because smart guy. He was able to put together a very good book, multiple books really on engineering continuous workflows and things like that, especially for IT delivery. But what he found was, from a system-wide perspective, an organizational perspective, the thing that was really preventing a big optimal flow of value, it was these things at the fuzzy front end. So then when he says water scrum fall, right, this is really what he's talking about. So there's flow-based work or Agile-based work focused on value and delivery. It just sits here in the middle of the Agile team. And then these top and bottom ones are sandwiching our Agile practice. And even if you have a safe adoption, I think this still happens all the time, right? Like safe and frameworks like that, they have a tendency to kind of transform themselves full circle until next thing you know, you just have another like top-down, long cycle time driven set of management structures sitting on top of the people who are responsible for innovating. So that's just a little bit about that. Now let's talk about that. So if you are waiting on all this stuff, the fuzzy front end. Now, if you caught my last web seminar, I showed this slide as well. This is a slide from Gene's consultancy and his book publisher. And what you can kind of see is you have this interesting exponential curve as capacity increases. So what you can see is that up to about 90%, 90, even like 95% busy. If you're like 90% busy, then that's pretty negligible. I mean, there's not a lot of difference between being completely idle or being 90% busy. But once you get more than 90% busy, and this is for any resource, individual or entire department, or even the entire organization, once you're more than 90% busy, all of a sudden, people are going to have to wait on you because you have so much to work on that you have to plow through that work item by item. And so there's going to be a lot of waiting. Something, you can't work on everything at once. So something has to take its place in the queue and wait. So waiting time increases exponentially in proportion to how much capacity or how busy people are. Right. So once you're above this point and you're kind of into this, like the high end of the spike, you can see how exponentially, very rapidly, the wait times increase. So this is too much work in progress, too much. Now, interesting, like who has ever spoken to a product owner or a software team or an IT team or a system administrator or a DBA or even a C-level executive? Who has ever dealt with one of those people who are less than 90% busy? Hopefully I can hear us all chuckling about that, right? Because they're always so busy. But so when the capacity gets very, very full, flow slows down. So thinking back to that idea about product flow and value flow, when you have full capacity, you have slow flow. So if we map the value stream across this software engine, which, as we established, at least for today, synonymous with innovation, what you're going to see is that there's a lot of waiting. There's a lot of waiting because the functions are at such full capacity. And so when there was a lot of waiting, there's a lot of waste. If we visualize this, you can kind of see how large the ratio of waiting is to the ratio of value-added work. So that's a big problem, right? Waiting is not good. Waiting is wasteful. There's no delivery happening if things are waiting. Yes, Craig, exactly. Never. Me neither. Like you just don't encounter people who are responsible for technology work who are not at full capacity. And you probably had to wait on those people. So this is why, right? So when there's waiting, then there's queuing, and then that equals waste, right? So now we're going to introduce the last rock star for today. This is Don Reinertsen. Now, Don, even if you haven't heard the name of Don Reinertsen, if you're familiar with SAFe, SAFe has this rubric for prioritizing things called weighted shortest job first, or WSJF. That is based in part on some of Don's concepts. Although I'll be forthright in saying, like, I actually like Don's concepts. I think they're superior to the way that SAFe codified those concepts. Just my opinion, personal opinion. But Don is the master of queuing theory, and in organizations, specifically around product development. So this is a somewhat dry read, but it's an invaluable book if you've never checked it out. So Don Reinertsen, he is the master of understanding how queuing and waiting and managing capacity across departments as we work on product development. And then he's also kind of the father of cost of delay. So Don, he has various measurements that he uses, but the one that he claims is most valuable is this measurement called cost of delay, or in other words, how much is it costing you in lost revenue, lost value, lost adoption for something not to get delivered. So if it's sitting there waiting, how long does it have to wait, and how much does it cost every day or whatever unit of time that something has to wait? So calculating that cost can be a really good way to prioritize. Now, Don is also a champion of figuring out formal and disciplined process-based ways to federate or decentralize decision power. Because when you have to wait on a central planning, right? I'll just leave it at that. But that gets slow, right? It gets when you have to wait on one particular decision maker to really evaluate and micromanage everything. If you can figure out rules that allow people closer to the edge, closer to the work itself, that they know what they have to do. Like, the leaders have put rules in place so that the people who are actually on the front line of the work, they know how to make the decisions for the situations they encounter. That's obviously much faster, right? So that's why Don is such a champion of decentralizing decision making. Now, here are a few little gems from Don, just cutting to the chase on some of the coolest ideas here. I think any analysis beats intuition. So if we think about the hippo, or we think about the committee making the investment decisions, what Don is saying is basically like, it's just anything, any type of methodical, systematic analysis. It doesn't even really have to be that good, but that will still beat intuition, because that will still bring some consistency, some shared understanding, some shared rules, and you need those things for sustained value creation at scale over time. And the committee might get lucky from time to time or make a good decision, but at enterprise scale, it's not a good way to run a railroad. Now, find a common economic basis. That's another interesting one of those foundational ideas that can apply in all kinds of situations. If you find the common denominators, just like, we have a fiat currency here in the U.S. where I'm presenting from, the U.S. dollar is the common economic basis. The U.S. dollar gives everybody a common component of language, vocabulary to do economic transactions. Everybody uses the same currency. So if we can find ways to do that within our own organizations, across our own workflows, that can really grease the wheels of process. It can really increase the flow, because now you have a tool that you can use for people to make decisions about value on their own and with their peers, rather than having to defer to someone up the decision-making chain. And this third one's pretty obvious, but making visible cues visible. So a lot of times, if you think about like that value stream map that we looked at, all that red that was waiting, that's all cued work. It's very important to figure out just how to visualize that, because sometimes you don't even know that it exists. And so, yes, Beverly, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Culture shift, absolutely necessary. And so I know that's kind of inferred here a little bit, but just because something requires a culture shift doesn't mean that it's not the way that it should be being done. I think a lot of times cultural headwinds are the big thing that holds us back. And it's like, well, sorry, that doesn't mean there's not a better way to do anything. We have to get out of our own way sometimes. And then there's business cases to be made here too. So sometimes the big wigs are receptive to that. So making visible cues visible, and then decentralize decision power. Now, to actually Beverly's point, if you look at this last bullet, front-end decision makers or, big wigs, that doesn't mean they're giving up control. They maintain control. It's all about designing rules so that the top level decisions, the strategic guidance at a control level that the leaders are driving through the workflow, that we're able to build rules, right, that will matriculate down and stay true to that vision. And there's a Jez Humble, Barry O'Reilly, and Joanne Molsky have another great book. It's called The Lean Enterprise, one of my favorite books. They actually talk about how to do this in a way that it doesn't lose the top level strategic command, but it gives people lower down on the food chain the tools that they need to decentralize the decision making power. So it's not about bypassing senior leadership. It's about basically getting the decision making power out of just the head of the senior leadership and designing rules to make that carry through. And then finally, Don's biggest guidance here: if you only calculate one thing, calculate cost of delay. And then there's an interesting example Don gives. You can find videos online of Don talking about this, but they were able to use this type of approach with work that Don did at Boeing. This has been a while back, and Boeing's been in the press lately, not for the best of reasons, but when they were designing and building the 737, Boeing was able to come up with rules that essentially, as they were trying to reduce weight when they were designing the aircraft, they were able to find the common economic basis and determine that essentially, if for every 1 pound of reduced weight, they knew for sure that was going to be a greater than $300 savings for the product and worth therefore that investment. So engineers who are working on the design of the plane, they no longer needed approval. If they could come up with a design change, then of course still subject to compliance and safety and things like that. But we're not talking about those types of approvals, but just in terms of the weight of the build when they were doing the designs, the engineers were then empowered to say, if you can find a way to reduce weight by 1 pound, then you are approved to do that, right? Like you don't have to seek further approval. Going back to Josh Arnold for a moment, now he takes cost of delay one step further with what he calls a CD3 score, where he kind of introduces a further aspect of time sensitivity to it. Cost of delay divided by duration, and that gives you a CD3 score. Now you have a really substantive way of qualifying and prioritizing based on value. I mentioned WSGIF earlier, and that's CD3 is kind of I think a better way, but it's along the same line, right? So there's a very interesting case study that you can find at Josh's website, Black Swan Farming. Now this is an actual project that was done where they went in and mapped all of the things in the backlog, whatever 70 plus features that were waiting to be built. And then they calculated cost of delay for those features. And what they saw was, once again, you see this exponential pattern. So what they saw was that these top, a very small number of features, these three up here, they had a very high cost of delay. So it was costing millions of dollars for this client for every unit of time that wasn't delivered. But that the workflow, the backlog was not prioritized that way. The backlog was prioritized. You often prioritize just first in, first out. That's a common queuing method. It's just whoever asked for it first, they got in line, they queued up, and they're the first ones to get worked on. Well, that means that you can have all this long tail of lower value features is all mixed up together with the really high value features. So what they did was they reorganized the backlog. It's just one example of how they did that. So how do you qualify value? Well, that's a whole other web seminar, and one that I hope to talk to you about in the near future. We talked about value stream mapping a couple of webinars ago. That's one way to get deeper on that. Understanding and qualifying value is a subject unto itself, but I will leave you just with these nuggets, right? This has to do with the analysis during the fuzzy front end. You should qualify and rank the value ASAP in the portfolio lifecycle. According to Jez, right, 70% of organizations are not using anything for this, right? What does Don say? Any analysis beats intuition. What does Josh say? Use cost of delay and a CD3 score to qualify that value and rank it, right? So that is where I will leave it for today. We are about at time. Just to sum up some of the key lessons here, find an economic heuristic. It can be cost of delay, it can be a CD3 score, it can be something else. But remember, any analysis is better than nothing. Build in Slack for downstream areas, right? Remember, once you're above 90 to 95% busy, then you're going to get very inefficient. So that's math, right? Like you can calculate the capacity, full capacity, slow flow, reduction in value creation. Enable work to be pulled downstream instead of pushed downstream. So I think that's gotten more popular with techniques like Kanban and stuff like that. We understand that to optimize flow, you've got to be able to pull. So stakeholders rank the value, and that's the next priority. And when a team has work capacity, they just pull from the top of the list and get going, and they don't have to spend any time thinking about priorities. To find ways to shorten the cycle time for upstream decisions and commitments, right? So if you have that's one of the benefits, by the way, of having an economic heuristic. If you have an economic model for prioritizing value, then you can do it much faster because there's not quite so much bike shedding and meetings and stuff about this. So help upstream decision makers find and implement value heuristics that are based on economic or financial modeling. It doesn't have to be super complicated. It can be basic. In fact, it's better if it's basic because then it's fast. And then outside of that, put the other decision-making power, push that downstream. And again, you do this with rules that people can follow, the combination of rules with fast prioritization so that people know what to work on next and apply the rules. Rules have been designed thoughtfully in accordance with senior decision makers so that the senior decision maker knows that their decision criteria are essentially being force multiplied throughout the entire work stream. That's how you do it. So take that as you will. May have generated some challenging ideas. I don't know. To be sure, there is an important cultural component there. To Beverly's last question, how do we do that in the face of rapid attrition? I think it's actually a great point. I think it's even if nothing else, it's very important to come up with long-lived or economic rules and heuristics, prioritization methods, ways to model rules that tie to the decisions that can kind of live on past individuals. I think that's a continuity is to be had there. So I hope that is helpful. I will pass it back to Laura and close out for the day. I've got to get back to work here myself, so I wish everyone an excellent afternoon. Thanks again so much for the time. I always enjoy presenting to you guys, and I hope you'll join me next time. All right, cheers.